Freedom is not free. Discover what it takes. It's time to tap and move forward.
Hello and welcome to Tap and Move Forward. I'm your host, Lynn Shelley. Today's show includes stories from a war environment. Some of the content is descriptive of difficult real war situations. This is a Veterans Stories episode. Jim Kemp joined the Navy Seabees in 1966. The Seabees is a naval construction battalion that's trained to drop tools and pick up weapons when necessary. After going through the training, Jim was sent to Vietnam. He was awarded the Vietnam Service Medal with 5 battle stars. Afterward, he went on to study Asian Studies with the GI Bill and now is a professor of Asian Studies at Florida State College. Here's the interview with Jim Kemp. Why did you join the military and how old were you?
Okay, I joined when I was 18. My father was a chief in the Navy, E7. My grandfather was in the English Army, World War I. He was actually in the Canadian Army. And my older brother was a second class or E5 machinist mate in the Navy. So I come from a military background. Also, all the kids on my street during the Vietnam War, the boys, one by one, all went off. Their fathers, too, had been in the Army, Marines, Navy during World War II. So it was expected, it was a social obligation that the boys would go when the nation called. In my particular neighborhood, it was a very blue-collar neighborhood in the South. There was no hand-wringing much other than having to leave home, but there was no question about whether you're going to go or not. The idea that you would not go would have been socially unacceptable as a male. I mean, right up and down the street. Maybe because I went in 66 and not later, some of those sentiments may have been modified. But at that time, there were guys from my high school I know who went to college solely to escape going to service. But I didn't learn about that until I came out of service and then went back to college in 1970. And some of the guys I knew in high school from 1965 were still in college. And their sole reason for there was to avoid the draft. My mindset at that time was I just scraped them off. I didn't have anything to do with them.
So do you feel then that you joined mostly out of responsibility, social responsibility?
Yes, it stemmed, from my family. There was no hand wringing. It was expected.
Were you excited at all, or was it just?
Well, yes, of course. At the time, I was an apprentice carpenter, and all the carpenters that I went to work with were World War II vets and Korean vets. I mean, it's a blue-collar background. So they expected me to go. I mean, it was just the time and place for men who had been in service in World War II in Korea to expect their sons and neighbors' sons to go to war if the country called for it. I mean, it was at least the people I associated with and was raised with and around had no qualms. I mean, it was just a different time and place.
Did you find any surprises when you joined the military, things you weren't expecting?
Well, yeah, just about. My very first day in boot camp at Great Lakes. That was my first airplane trip. And of course, I got airsick about 10 minutes after the plane left Jacksonville. But when we got to boot camp, I, had some expectation of the shouting and, not knowing what's going on and so forth. But my biggest shock was when we took us immediately out of the bus. Almost all of the people in my particular group were from Florida. And this was March 15th in t-shirts. We got to Great Lakes, a little northwest of Chicago, and there was 4 or 5 feet of snow on the ground. As you got off the bus, they gave you a Navy pea coat. Some guys had shorts on. And of course, many had long hair. I did not. It was just one of those quirks of fate. I always had I called it a beanball haircut. It was just what I had then. So you can't call it marching. It was more like herding us to the chow hall. And I got my tray. And of course, I knew what a cafeteria was, but that looks strange and that looks funny and that smells weird. And when I finally got to the end of the line, the only thing I had was a glass of milk, and nobody cared. So that night, there was no mom's refrigerator. So the next morning, I was ready to eat whatever was served. And it didn't matter whether I liked it or not, it all went down. So
your first night, you didn't eat anything. You had a glass of milk?
Had a glass of milk, and, the company commander didn't come down and hold my hand,
Not much hand holding that happens in the military.
No. So it was kind of a shock, but I mean, it wasn't like weird. The real weird came later, but that was like an eye opener that, I was on my own. I had to make my own way and figure out my own stuff.
Why did you choose the Navy?
Well, of course, because of my family. My father was in, my older brother was in. But more importantly, I was a carpenter apprentice, and I wanted to continue being a carpenter. So instead of joining the regular Navy, I directly enlisted into the Navy Seabees, which is the construction branch of the Navy. That way I could continue in the construction line. And my ultimate aim was to go to carpenter school in the Navy and then continue working as a carpenter. So that skill set would be valued to me when I got out.
Cool. So you knew what job you were getting into.
Well, I knew what the recruiter said.
There was some differences.
Well, at first they didn't want to let me go into Seabees. They just said, just go to regular boot camp. So I told them no, I'd been to the Army and they'd let me in the Corps of Engineers. And the guy pulled out the sheet without blinking an eye and says, okay, I'll sign you up for the Seabees. So they were paying a little bait and switch. They had a quota to fill. I did go in. I was a construction apprentice and then a recruit, of course, in boot camp. And then when I left boot camp, I was a construction apprentice. And then I didn't get sent to carpenter school. So I was sent to Adak, Alaska in the Aleutian Islands, 1,300 miles out. It was closer to Siberia than it was the United States. And my first duty coming there was as a compartment cleaner, which is a Navy term for a janitor.
Oh, geez.
Actually, it was better than the Plan B, which was working in the mess hall as a pot and pan cleaner. So when coming directly out of boot camp, that's the normal route. You either become one or the other for 3 months. After that, I was going to be assigned to the motor pool in the tire shop. So I went down to look at that, and that was like, oh no, early October. And it was a Quonset hut dug into the tundra. There were no trees there, essentially. There were a few token trees that were planted. And the frost was on the inside of the roof, and there was snow on the roof. And the mechanics had their tools on the heater, because when they get cold and brittle, they'll snap. And they were pounding on tires and using blow torches to heat things up. So I said, wow, it's really cold in here. And you can see your breath drift up to the top, and then it would freeze. And he says, oh, you're not going to be in here. I said, I'm not. He said, no, you're going to be in the outside crew. So the new guys, of course, always get the worst. So, you're going to be pulling people out of the snow and taking their tires off and bringing them to us. Then you go back out. So went back, and I requested permission to remain a compartment cleaner. And of course, this was odd because it was also used for punishment. So it had to go up the chain of command. I had to go see the executive officer. And he says, why do you want to have your next 9 months for what we normally use as punishment? I said, well, Commander, I'm from Florida. My coldest day in my entire life was June 15th when I got here. And it's been getting colder ever since. I said, I wear my long underwear in the barracks cleaning. And it was one of the few times that I seen senior officers smile. He had to suppress a grin. He says, granted. So I was allowed to become a permanent compartment cleaner. Now, this was attached to, I have to use some Navy jargon, but it's the Master at Arms Force. They're the police force in the regular Navy. So my secondary duties were actually walking around fire watch at nighttime, phone watches and that sort of thing. But they were pretty nominal in terms of anything really demanding, except you had to be in the right uniform, the right time, in the right place every time. So I applied to go to carpenter school, and I was recommended for it, and I did. By that time, it was the summer of 1967. All Seabees were going to Vietnam to be with the Marines, all of them. So I went to Camp Pendleton to train with the Marines. And then I went to survival school in Whidbey Island, which was, again, kind of humorous. Because the time I got up there, it was snowing, and it was survival school for the Arctic. But I was going to Vietnam, and I thought it was kind of funny. But those principles of survival are pretty broad. So
Still valid.
Yeah. So, but by that time I was a constructionman, E3. And again, I had no real responsibilities other than taking orders and following. At that rank, you're not very independent. And I was a pretty good sailor. I didn't have a hard time with that. My only transition in the Navy took me was why I was being punished because of what somebody else did, mass punishment.
Right.
And it was drummed into you constantly that a ship fights and dies as a unit.
Yes.
So you're only strong as your weakest link.
Right. Which
So,
does mean you get punished.
so internal discipline is the most powerful. If you're disciplined because someone's standing over you with a club, that's external. But there were a few people who just didn't seem to make that connection. They weren't evil or wicked, but they had some quirk that maybe the chief won't mind this time. Well, yes, that's how he got to be chief. He minds every time.
Yes.
And the hammered, and really senior petty officers that are strict and fair, I had no problem with.
Right.
I expected it, and like I said, there were a few people that, I don't know, it seemed like most of the misery fell on a very few small people. They're not criminal activities, but, you know, being a little bit late and a little bit out of uniform, a little bit out of needing a haircut, you know, just, so, but that, by then I was pretty well suited because I'd been in the Navy about a year and a half. And then in November of '67 is when I went to Vietnam. And I was sent to the Naval Support Activity Da Nang. And then I was, that was only like a week or so for transition. And then I was sent to the detachment in Chu Lai, south of Da Nang, about 50 miles. And that Navy detachment, about half of it was devoted to unloading ships, ammunition, cargo, food, and stuff, to be forwarded to the Marines, bombs and sort of the thing. The other half, which I was in, was called Public Works. And they did, of course, truck work and transportation and that sort of thing. But I went to the division that did repair work. Stuff would get blown up, stuff would catch on fire. What, you know, just it needed to be rebuilt. We were doing repair work. So initially I was sent to the carpenter shop. But I got along with the Vietnamese very well for some reason. I think it's a blue collar background. And they made me in charge of the labor shop. Now, still E3, but I was in charge of 3 other sailors, also E3, and 45 Vietnamese. In the regular Navy, you would never see this. But in the Seabees in construction, it's very, very unusual that the skill sets require you to do certain things regardless of rank. When you're pouring concrete, an E7 would get in there and help because that concrete's going to set up. In the Black Shoe Navy, regular Navy, he'd stand there holding the coffee cup. You know, so the ethics, I don't know if it's ethics, but the tradition of the Seabees were all the ranks work all the time when required. Of course, they had the military side too, but it was very, very honed to doing what needed to be done. Then the military side of it, that's sort of the professional side, was that we had to defend whatever we're working on. We were not assault troops. So our military duties, we had 2 of those. One was perimeter duties, which was kind of like World War I, barbed wire trenches, bunkers, machine guns, a static line of defense. The other was having emergency repair parties. That if something got hit, for example, the hospital, they had a crew. There were some electricians, some steel workers, some carpenters, some riflemen, some people with lights would go out and make emergency extractions or that sort of thing. So I was a really good perimeter watch. I never let it on because I was scared of the dark. So I was very vigilant. I was always expecting the booger man to hop out from behind some box. So I'm laughing at myself, but it is the truth. I was always alert all the time. Following that, I received orders to go to Argentia, Newfoundland, Canada. I was there from January of 69 to September of 69, when the chief came in and said, "Can you pack your sea bag and be out in 2 weeks?" Which I was getting out 6 months early, which is a surprise to me, because you know when you go in, you know when you get out. And the Navy was cutting back people that have already served in Vietnam as Seabees, unless they re-upped. They were doing the pullback. So I had to go down and see the senior chief, E8, to get the re-up talk. Now, some guys went down there and gave him a big blast of why they hated the Navy, or they didn't like this and they didn't like that. But I knew that he could cause me more misery in my last 2 weeks than I could cause him in 2 weeks. So I went down for the re-up. This is 69, and he had $7,000 in cash right there. In modern day money, that's a lot. By then, I was E4. I had a field promotion in Vietnam to E4, which is a kind of, think about it. Most of the Navy promotions are done by taking an examination, and the score dictates those pass. Seabees didn't have the time to study because they were in the field with the Marines. So I don't know the exact mechanism, but anyhow, I got a field promotion to E4. So when I went to and I could have made E5, except I didn't have the other 6 months. You had to have time and rate, at least a year's E4. So the chief said, our senior chief said, you can put on your E5 stripes right now, get $7,000, and we'll send you to B school, which is the next level of carpenter school. And then, that was expected, that because I'd heard this before, So then he says, and we're going to send you to EOD school.
Oh, wow.
I said, explosive ordnance demolition? He goes, yes. I said, that's for guys that work with bombs and, I said, why am I going? He says, well, we're having so many casualties from mines and booby traps. Now they call them IEDs, but
right.
You're going to be a minesweeper on land, and you'll get another $25 a month for hazardous duty on top of the $100 for being in Vietnam. So I said, well, Senior Chief, do I get one of those silver flaming bombs to put on my uniform? He goes, oh, yes. And of course, he thought this was good because he was not going and I was. So I said, well, Chief, I've been thinking about I'm going to go to school on the GI Bill. And if I want to come back in the Navy, I'll come back in as an ensign. So even if you make Master Chief, you will have to salute me. And he grinned, and he says, you're right. He said, sound like you have a plan. Says, but you have so many months to reconsider even as you get out. So I laughed. So then I started, I got home in September of 69, the latter part. And then I started school at the junior college in January of that year on the GI Bill. So that's sort of a narrative of what was going on. So the GI Bill for me was very, very good. While I was in Newfoundland, my duties, it was an old seaplane base, but seaplanes had passed their technical capabilities long ago. But the airstrip went right down into the water where the seaplanes could come in and out. And that's where I had to from midnight to about 6 o'clock in the morning, I'd be out there with the gasoline truck, gassing up vehicles. About every, I don't know, fourth or fifth night. So I can't recall exactly, but at least once a week. And it was brutally cold. So the automatic cutoff didn't work, and you'd end up getting gasoline on you. I was afraid to turn the truck off because I didn't want to get in with gasoline on me, hit the ignition switch, and get a spark. So when I get back to the barracks, I'd stand outside. Sometimes it was below zero. I would take my clothes off down to my boots and run inside and hope I didn't meet anybody with a cigarette into the shower and wash my clothes and me at the same time. Well, it was just what you had to do. So it came out in the plan of the day that if you went to college classes on the base that were offered by the University of Maryland, that you had to report for duty, but then you were allowed to go to class and relieve from duty. So I said, oh boy, this, so I started taking classes at night. And I did end up getting 9 credits by going to classes at night. And it was really, really good for me because I didn't think I could go to college. I didn't think it, but I found out if you show up and read the book, you can usually make a B. So it relieved me of my anxiety about how tough college was. So when I got out, I was eager to go to college. But many years later, I was interested in Marine Corps and Navy history in China between the World War I and II. So in Tallahassee was retired Lieutenant General Snowden, 3-star general. So I know how bureaucrats work because I was a bureaucrat at the time. So I called him up and asked him if he had a person I could call about this period of history. So as soon as the general got on the phone, my wife was standing there and my voice changed. And I became very stiff and very formal. And I got the information. Yes, General, no, General, da, 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 da. So when I hung up, my wife teased me about it. She says, I've never heard you speak like that. And I said, well, my mind flipped back to when I was a 3rd class. And I said, I'm not used to talking to generals. And I said, it's actually kind of amusing in a kind of, because I didn't think about it, really. I said, some things just stick with you, and later we had a 50th anniversary party for Seabees when I was in Tallahassee, and the general showed up. He was in full kit, white gloves, sword, medals, white hair, and my wife met him and shook his hand. He shook her hand and said, "Oh, gracious." He was very gracious. Originally, he was from Virginia, a graduate of VMI. Oh, he was so polite. And we went to the meeting and we had the meeting. So on the way home, my wife, that's the only Marine she's ever met, was a Lieutenant General. And she goes, I can't see why you say all those ugly things about Marines. Says that was the most gracious man I've ever met in my life. And he wasn't pretending. I said, hon, so you have to expect if you get to be the second command of any of the services, you have to have real social skills. that grace and so forth is real. It's not pretend. But when the Marines go forward, they stand up to a man and go forward. So I said, it's kind of interesting how your mind, even though things are way in the reserve and you're not consciously thinking about it, some ideas will come back. It's kind of amazing how clear and, powerful they are still. But here where I live in Fernandina, it's between the nuclear sub base and St. Mary's. I think I can see it out if the trees went there from my house. And then to the north, only about, 20 miles at most, is Naval Station, Mayport, very large Navy installation. So this town has a lot of retired Navy and surprising a number of Marines. So I still see a lot of vets, informally. My most fun was I'm 72, and at the gym where I work out, there is the Marine recruiter. And he looks like a shaved ape. I mean, he has so many muscles. And he was laying on the bench and he was bench pressing 320 pounds, something like this. So I watched him. After he did his third set of 10, his face was purple. And the veins were all popped out and he was sweating and puffing. And the guys were watching him. So I just leaned over and said to him, "You never would have made it in the old Corps." And he grinned, because he knew if I knew how to press that button, that it was an inside thing. So later he got up and come over and talked to me. And I told him that he wanted to know how I knew that. I said, "Well, I'm an old squid," is what Marines call Navy. But I'm a graduate of Camp Pendleton, 1967. I said, "That was before you were born." I said, "I was trained by the old Corps." And we both started laughing because he knew I was just jiggling this chain. So I have a great deal of admiration for Marines. I really do. That part, I retain some genuine fondness for that kind of camaraderie. Even today, it's pretty powerful. I first went back to Vietnam in 2008, which was the 40th anniversary of the Tet Offensive. I'd retired from my job with the state, and I went back with a couple of fellows that I had worked with who had also retired. And one of them was, I went to West China. I sort of skipped over. After I graduated from FSU in Asian Studies, I went to Taiwan for 4 years to study to read and write Chinese and to study the classics. I went back, got my master's degree in East Asian Studies. I ran out of money. It's the end of my GI Bill. And I took a temporary job with what I thought was the state. It ended up what I call golden handcuffs. I was well paid. I made advancements, but it wasn't in anything I had studied. So when I graduated, but I continued going to conferences and stuff on anthropology in East Asia. So by that time, there were 4 of us that started. After 2 weeks, 2 guys left. And after the plane left Kunming in Yunnan province, it's next to Tibet. We're flying into Hanoi. And my buddy said, "I need to remind you that I was a Vietnam War protester. Is that going to bother you?" I said, "No, not really." I said, "That was then, this is now. You made a choice and I did too. But I need to tell you that if I catch a really bad vibe when I land in Hanoi, I'm going to be on the next plane out of there. And I don't care where it lands. And I'm serious." He said, "You serious?" I said, "Yeah." I said, I'm getting kind of a lot of anxiety. So we landed, and airports all around the world are very impersonal. You get in this line, you get in that line, you get your luggage, you wait on it, you go through customs and they hit you with a stamp, and you go through immigration, they hit you with a stamp. And next thing you know, I'm waiting for a taxi. Neither one of us had any idea. I had one contact about a place, a restaurant that I met on Facebook, a guy. We went there. He recommended a hotel, and there we went. So I got on the phone, and I had met a Vietnamese professor who was doing research on woodblock printing in Vietnam over the internet. Never saw him. And when I was in China, he said, when you get to Hanoi, let me know. So I did. The next day he came and picked us up to go visit temples, which I wanted to do. And we exchanged some gifts and some books and things. Just he looked at me and says, "Is this the first time you've ever been to Vietnam?" And I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't deny it. So I said, "No, it's my 40th anniversary." And his English is really, really good. He goes, "Wow, you were in the Tet Offensive. What province, what division, da, 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 da." Well, I thought I was prepared for anger, but not real curiosity. It was like his high school and my high school had played for the state championship. And he was trying to figure out if I was offense or defense, So he apparently my face must have changed. He says, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's the official Vietnamese Communist Party line that individual American servicemen are not responsible for the war." So wherever we went, this is in Hanoi that we bombed the living hell out of. He would make no mistake. This is a American GI come back to visit. And I was always welcome. It was very funny. And I've been back, that was 2008, and went back in 2009, 2011, 2013, and 2017.
Wow.
So I've been back 5 times. And I've never had any trouble. The last time, which was the summer of 2017, I was with a professor, and we're going north of Hanoi, almost to the China border, to visit some temples. And when I got there, I could hear people speaking Mandarin Chinese, because I do, in the street. And it kind of surprised me. We went to his friend's house. As soon as we got there, we were invited for breakfast. And he knew I was a GI, and he wanted to know what year I was there, da, 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 da. So I got out a paper and drew a crude map of Vietnam, and I showed him where I was. And then he showed me where he was. We were there at the same time. We're only about 100 miles apart. So he looked at me, and he said in English, which I didn't know he spoke. He said, "We're enemies. Let's have breakfast." And he grinned. And we all went in and ate breakfast. And his daughter was studying English in Saigon. She was there. Then they took us around, hand carried us around this temple complex. So it was very, very interesting that, I've met Viet Cong, of course, South Vietnamese Army troops, and regular NVA troops. And they're all, in my age range. So there's not a lot of them. It's a hard life there. But the professor I was with, I asked him if he was in the war. He said, "Yes, I was in Cambodia." And then he was pulled out and sent up north to fight the Chinese when the Chinese invaded Vietnam. So the attitude was the American war, which is that's what they call it, was a temporary problem. But the threat from China is 2,000 years old and will continue. So it was just a very, very different perspective. So when you meet people on an individual basis, you get some stuff and you get some emotional content that history, especially modern histories, all have an agenda. And writers pick and choose because they have to. You can't write everything. But normally at the non-com level and below, you don't have a grand sweep of history. You have a task to do that's right in front of you. It's just weird. It's just, as I get older, the weirder it is. At the time while it's going on, you really don't have time to be reflective. I mean, you have a task to take care of.
So you studied East Asian studies in college.
Yes.
What drew you to that?
Well, when I got back from Vietnam, it sounds pretty dramatic. I didn't understand what happened. I didn't know who I was when I got back because I didn't fit. I went off to war as a kid out of high school, and I thought I would just get off the plane and all that would be different. Not only was I different, the whole country in the 60s, especially late 60s, was undergoing enormous cultural dislocation or whatever you want, but change. So there were so many things I didn't relate to because that 4-year chunk, I was not in contact with popular culture. We'd get a little bit on the Armed Forces radio, essentially for 4 years, or 3.5 for sure. I was out of contact with American culture. And it was in Navy culture, which was very guided and very purpose directed and so forth. So when I got back, started going to school, I thought that if I had an academic background, I could understand what happened. But the more I studied in the abstract, because academia is that way. So when I went back to Taiwan in 1973, I started getting a lot more emotional contact with real people and real temples and real, historical things. So I went back and got my master's degree, this time with much better Chinese skills. So, but still, it was a little bit too raw for me because that's only about, I got my master's in 1977. So that's only 10 years after the war. So my feelings and stuff were still pretty raw. And I was still trying to sort out a lot of things that were really out of my control. Then later, after I was a bureaucrat, as a career, I had to set some of that stuff down aside and just go about the business of living. So it started giving me a hard time. And it oddly would quirk itself at work. I followed orders pretty good. I was on time. Some of the skill sets as a military were very good for me in civilian life. So one day I was going to lunch and our office secretary came in and says, "You got to take this call." I said, "No." It says, "It's from the governor." I said, "Me? Why me?" He says, "Well, you're the only one here." And the boss, her name was Molly, has a sign on the door, "Under no circumstance interrupt this meeting. You have to take the call." So I did. I went. And of course, it wasn't the governor, it was his aide. So he read me the question, or he asked the question, and I wrote it down and read it back to him. And he gave me his confidential phone direct. You can't get it from the, regular phone book. And I said, "When does the Governor expect a reply? I said, 10 minutes. I said, very well. So I got on my feet and went to the door. And the secretary, she, oh, don't go. I said, I'm going in. So I knocked on the door, opened it up. And there were 3 women in there. One was my boss, one was her boss, and the other one was the secretary who does report directly to the governor. And they were going over the budget with a steel ruler, line by line on this printout. A 0 here, a 0 there, you could lose 10 employees or $10,000 or, so they were. So my boss looked up on me and she said, did you see the sign on the door? I said, yes, Molly, but I ignored it. You have a call from the governor, here's the number and the question. But if you're too busy, I'll call them back and say, you're too busy and you'll call when you get time. Well, of course, the 3 of them started laughing. No, I think I'll take that call. So I left, went to lunch. So it came, I don't know, about 2 o'clock, she's in my office. She says, I want to thank you. Says, it's really bad if we don't respond. I said, yeah. She says, nobody in the office, they would have, said everybody else in the office would just put a piece of tape on my door to call. Why did you do that? I said, well, Molly, I said, I'm loyal to you. And sometimes loyalty is not rewarded. I said, I wanted, I knew it was important, but I said, I just want you to keep that in your basket of things that someday, I make a lame brain decision about something that, the balance beam of justice will fall out. So there were times when we'd have meetings and the upper level bureaucrats wouldn't say the emperor has no pants on. I would. And be polite and, courteous and choose my words carefully. But the secretary, which is in the cabinet, would tell these people to leave the room and me stay and reassign me to solve this particular problem. So some of my Navy training turned out to be a double-edged sword, because when you have problems, the problem solver always gets them. So, but I took a certain amount of pride in that I was honest, So some of my Navy training turned out very well for me in terms of discipline and so forth.
So what do you think was the most important habit or skill set that you got out of your military training?
This will sound, well, being on time and being prepared. That sounds very ambiguous, but some people can't get those 2 connections. Being punctual and having whatever you're supposed to be done on time. Seems like very ordinary that you should not even, it's not worthy of mention. But in fact, it's a pretty important skill set.
Absolutely.
Other things, for example, there's a cliche that never volunteer for anything. I didn't find that true. There's a few things that I did learn in the Navy. I don't like a shirker. I don't like somebody who's not pulling their oar. And that is transferred into a very interesting skill set as far as working with people about religion, race, sexual orientation, all the stuff that happens after 5 o'clock. I want to know what you're doing right now on the job, pulling your oar, not pulling your oar. So that was actually pretty strongly emphasized when I was in the Navy. You have to work whatever's there.
Right.
Now, I'm not going to say I'm
all that you cared about was, can they perform their job well?
Yeah. And if they did, I got along with them fine. If they didn't, depending on who they were and what they were, it was always the burden of trying to figure a workaround. And unless it got really obnoxious, I would do the workaround. But of course, when you're working with people, there's some you admire their technical knowledge. Some people have really good work ethic. Some people are, in between, all over the place. So, but in the Navy, the chain of command was really enforced, so that there's a very weak chain of command in my experience in civilian life as compared to the military.
Yes, I can see that, like culturally, and the honor and the respect that comes along with that.
Yeah.
The story that you told earlier with your boss, like it makes sense to me that you had an understanding of priorities and honor as a combination, and you understood in that situation it was important enough, given your respect and understanding of the hierarchy, that this was a situation where you ignore the sign and you walk into the door to tell them what's going on.
Yeah. So, but by and large, I got along swell. The unit I was in, like I said, it was very strange. I say strange because all of the men were former servicemen at the same time period, Army, Navy, Marines. So there was a lot of camaraderie right there, just instantly. My boss one time, I had a different boss. Her brother was in the Marine Corps, and he had a lot of trouble adjusting. He had a lot of problems. And one day, she was talking to me about it, and she had two sons that were 19, one 18 and 19, something like that. She said, my sons could never do what my brother did. I said, Pat, I respect you, but you're wrong. They haven't been through the same experience. It's, in my opinion, of what men can do, a lot different than what civilians expect. And my wife was at one time at work, they were having trouble with this guy who was 19. And he was in a rock band at night. His work ethic was, he was a part-time worker anyway. Worked for Kelly Services, where they just, he was an envelope stuffer and so forth. So anyhow, my wife said, what do you expect? He's only 19. And then I got on the soapbox of what I expected at 19. So it does make a very strong impression over a long period of time about your expectations.
So when you were in Vietnam, how did you handle with the stress? What did you do to help yourself to navigate the stress of Vietnam?
The survival instinct clicks in, the adrenaline. And at my rank, again, what I had to perform was very narrow in scope. Get to the bunker, nighttime. Get underground. We would get a message over the radio, telephone to our bunker to do something or not do something. So we would just have to sit in the bunkers and take the bombardment, 122 millimeter rockets, mortars, some small arms, but they were actually shooting at the airstrip, trying to close it down. Well, they would shoot a few at us to distract whoever. Like I said, the coordination of all this, I have no idea about, in fact. But we would get rocketed. Now, I was on a repair party, and the MASH hospital, the Army medevac hospital, got hit. So we had to go and make an emergency repair at night. The explosion was nearby and overturned. So, of course, electricity was out, and I was the guy holding what's called the battle lantern. It's a big flashlight. And we had to go in to this one room and rescue the guys that were wounded. This particular room were like triple amputees. hooked up to IVs and stuff. Essentially, it was a room they were taken to die. They were pumped full of morphine or whatever. So their bunk, some of them were blown out of it, some of them were turned down, some of them were hit again. We had to get them out. Well, the horror of that overwhelms everything by the necessity of getting the job done. So of course you're frozen for a moment, but then you realize these guys really need help. I mean, really need help, and they need it right now. And you're going to have to go wring your hands some other time. So we go in. Well, this did not happen every night, but it happened every night somewhere to somebody. And you had to do this. There was no mental health. There was no counseling. There was nothing. It was always.
They didn't have any options available for you for support
No.
that way?
No. Not until well after the war.
Wow.
So you just had to suck it up. But later years, it comes back to haunt you. So I did go to the vet center, and I started going there at least weekly, sometimes twice a week for classes. And I did that for more than 10 years. But I continue going to the VA. I see a psychiatrist. In addition to that, I have problems from Agent Orange. So I have diabetes, I have peripheral vascular disease, I have neuropathy in my legs, and I also I just had my 99th skin cancer cut off. So you distance yourself from dwelling on it, but still it comes back. At odd times, sometimes at night in your sleep. I've had a recurring dream over the years. It's very puzzling because its content is actually very benign. We used to have to take malaria pills. They're big, almost about the size of a quarter and kind of thick. And they had them in a big bowl as you went to the chow hall. You're supposed to take one a week. Well, sometimes I'd be in the chow hall and I couldn't remember if I'd taken mine this week because the days sort of blur. I mean, Monday's not any different than Tuesday.
Sure.
So I'd be standing there trying to think, should I take this malaria pill? Well, I have that recurrent dream of me can't deciding if it's time to take the malaria pill. And it wakes me up, and then it gets me very conscious thinking about this, that, and the other thing. So it's kind of weird because my heart will be racing, I'll be sweating. But the content of the dream is actually quite benign. I mean, it's one of those weird things in your head that plugs in. And so, but that'll get me up walking around. And then the other quirk I have is that I'll admit to anyway. All doors to the exterior have to be locked. I do perimeter checks.
You still do perimeter checks of your house?
Yeah. And I've locked my wife out a time or two, and she gives me hell. So we had to put another key outside. So in case I locked her out, because if I find the door, the front, any of the perimeter doors unlocked, I just lock them. And it's not conscious. It's just, So sometimes that's not too amusing because you'll get fired up.
So if you could give advice to a newly enlisting member, what would it be?
If you're thinking about the GI Bill, it's a really good thing. I teach, and I have students that are going into service after they finish college. And it's subsidized before they go in service in some cases. But if they come back out of the service, the GI Bill now is much better than the one at my time. So it gives you an opportunity to go places and see things. And so if you're careful about your choices, and not all of them come true, you can choose things you don't get. But there's a lot of military skills that are transferable to civilian life. But if you're thinking about a career, you have to be a person that thinks ahead. For young people, it's an interesting time because right now currently employment situation is very nice on average across the country. But there are people in town who look around and say, I want to do something different. I want to go places. I want to do something. So the service gives them a leg up on that. And I know myself and my wanderlust of still going back, there's certain kinds of cultural experiences that are just interesting. They're fun.
Yes.
But I was on some guys who never left the base. They stayed. They went from the barracks to work to the chow hall and back, and there was like a Bermuda Triangle. They didn't reach out. They didn't try to grow, and of course they were miserable. They just so it's a big challenge. But work, like I said, I work out at the gym, and there was a couple very young fellows that had on a Marine T-shirt. Pain is weakness leaving the body.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that one.
So I said, they look awful young,
Yeah.
So you in the Corps? I said, oh no, I'm going to go in the summer. We're working out, to get ready for boot camp. I said, oh, that's a good idea. So I would say, encourage them, you look, you're working out, da, da, da. So I said, have you thought about this? About what in the brains, what would you like to do? And as serious as an 18-year-old can be, he says, if I'm lucky, I'll get into the infantry.
I've met a few like that.
And my response was Semper Fi. Because, that's what he wanted.
Yes. Yeah.
And I've seen him since then, after about a year, he went away. And he was at the gym. And he said, oh, I've been on deployment, and I've done this, and I've done that. Now I'm going to Korea. And he was all gung-ho.
Are there any books, documentaries, or historical figures that have been influential to you in your life or while you were in the military?
Well, while I was in the military, I liked reading Moby Dick.
Really?
There's one particular scene where the Pequod, the ship, is in a storm. And Captain Ahab, of course, is mad as a March hare. And his first mate, or the executive officer, he orders them to put up on more sails because they're going after Moby Dick in this storm. And Starbuck doesn't want to do it. And Captain Ahab's reply was, in heaven above, there is one God, and on this ship, there's one captain, aloft. I just went, arg. I had actually kind of, when I came home from Vietnam, of course, I had 30 days leave. But while I was home, I got a message to catch a radiogram. A certain plane did X-rayed ZZZ in Fort Dix at a certain time and place. Well, that added 27 days to my leave. So it was at Christmas time. I'm going, whoopee, So I reported to Newfoundland, and immediately they put me on report for being 27 days over the hill. They didn't get the message. So immediately I was going to go to Captain's Mess, Article 15. Then immediately I would go to court-martial for 27 days. So I ended up going to the captain. None of these people had seen me before. And so I was standing before the mast. And they read the charges, and the captain said, do you have? And so I gave him the radio message. And he looked at the admin officers. Have you seen this? He goes, no. So the captain says, at the time I was E3, he said, I've been in this man's Navy 37 years, and I've never had 57 days leave. Didn't you think it was unusual. And under that stress, I'm not a funny guy. I mean, it's deadly serious. You know, it's very formal and it's not playing around. I said, no, Captain, in the Pacific Fleet, sailors don't question the orders of commanders. I follow my last command. And that's by the book. And he looked at me and says, what do you think of me? And I did the Moby Dick thing. In heaven above, there's one God. On this ship, there's one captain. He goes, dismissed. And he looked at my jacket and he said, this man's highly decorated, which I am. Says, make sure he's taken care of and so forth. So Moby Dick had a very riveting. So in the service, that was a sort of book that, because I was very interested in acquiring Navy lore or stuff. So I'd read books on that sort of stuff. It wasn't much later, I mean, really much later, that I started reading stuff about Vietnam. And it was always very formal histories. Personal accounts and that sort of thing. Personally, I've had a hard time reading through them. It triggers things inside me that I just don't like to see. Now, I did go see the movie Full Metal Jacket. In the first part about Marine boot camp, there were probably 100 people in the audience. And Ermy is so funny as a drill instructor. He's running around and shouting and using really foul language.
Right.
I started giggling and laughing. And there was one other person a few rows away laughing. And my wife kept elbowing me, says, stop that. This is not funny. I said, it certainly is. Watching somebody else get it. I said, it's hilarious. I said, this guy is nailing it. I said, so it was something I normally don't, go to see. But that particular part was kind of funny.
Yeah. Yes. And still to this day, I think a lot of people talk about that particular scene. But Jim Kemp, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your perspectives and your willingness to share them with my listeners.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode and found a new mindset to help you excel. Jim talked about the climate of the Vietnam era. We are lucky that because of pioneers in the military like Jim, the military member now receives more support from both the military and the general public. Wherever you find yourself in life, understand that someone has struggled and suffered, and that suffering helped pave the way for improvements in the world, which have made your life better, likely in ways you take for granted. For more information on Jim, please visit www.tamfpodcast.com/SEABEE. If you have ideas for future episodes or want to talk about something in this episode, please visit the Tap and Move Forward website or social media sites.